Hi, I'm Greg Murphy. I'm a student at EIT doing the course DMC 15 52872WA, the Advanced Diploma of Robotics and Mechatronics Engineering. Doing a presentation on the environment for Module 11, which is applying the fundamentals of professional engineering. The topic I'll be talking to today is about an environmental issue in Australia, and I've selected mining. And by mining, I mean extractive industries in the totality rather than just terrestrial mining. And we'll look at the environmental impacts, but also in the context of the benefits that accrue to mining as weighed up against environmental impacts. So let's take a look at that and we'll move straight on to the next slide. So mining is a critical industry in Australia. Our national wealth is inherently linked to Australia's extractive industries. We can see from the graph on the right there that mining and oil and gas contribute about 10% to the national budget. And indeed, that total sum is about $85 billion per year, both in tax and royalty revenues. Obviously, this is critical to the Australian economy, but it also has an impact on our trading partners who rely on Australia for the provision of raw materials. And this particular issue has been brought into sharp relief recently with the war in the Middle East, where oil and gas supplies have been cut off that our trading partners rely upon, particularly gas, and come back and look at Australia as being a stable and reliable partner. So this is an implication in respect to the benefits, let's say, against the environmental impacts. And so that brings us to the point that whilst the economic benefits are enormous, there are also significant environmental impacts. So firstly, we'll take a look at the extractive industry categorization. In this instance, I've broken it down into open cut mining, and that picture on the top left there is a classic open cut mine in the Pilbara for iron ore. As you can see, it's visually, you can see the impact on the environment straight away. You have underground mining, and whilst at a visual level, say above ground, the impact is not as dramatic, but the issues are still the same when it comes to issues around water and contamination issues. There's artisanal mining, which is often not brought into the picture, mainly because relative to the big mining industries or extractive industries run by corporations, artisanal mining is typically done by small landholders or individuals. And so whilst the scale is smaller, the impact is outsized because they don't necessarily fall under a lot of regulations, such as remediation. And a picture of that you can see in the bottom right, which is an opal mining field out at Cooper Pedy, and there are dozens of these scattered around Australia. And you can see that once the mining or the artisanal mining is complete, the tailings are just left there. So it's small, but the environmental impact is in fact outsized for its size. We have offshore oil and gas and onshore oil and gas, and they're broken out because they are quite different, even though they produce the same materials, basically oil and gas. And on the top right, we have the classic offshore platform. And what makes it a bit different, I guess, than for onshore is that offshore you see this massive platform, but typically that is supported by 8 to 9 wellheads, and it's offloaded offshore and exported or piped to shore and refined into other products. And we'll see later that the impacts of this are quite different, say, from onshore. Now, onshore oil and gas within the terrestrial landscape of Australia, there is not very much, if any at all, liquid production of oil that happens in Australia anymore, but there's certainly a lot of gas production. And this gas production can be loosely categorized into the conventional, i.e. you drill, you find a basin or a reservoir of gas, such as the Moomba fields and in South Australia that go into the Gippsland area in Victoria. But more recently, you have coal seam gas, and this is quite significant because it has underpinned a very significant expansion in our gas production and export facilities. And this is very, very prevalent. You'll see up in Queensland in the Surat Basin. The coal seam production up there supports the Gladstone LNG plant, one of the biggest exporters of gas in the world. And then coming along straight on its heels is what they call shale, roughly it's or in the industry tight gas, which requires the fracking of the shale seam to extract the gas. Now, this is not a significant area of production in Australia. There is some, but it is certainly on its way to become perhaps the leading source of Australia's gas supply, both onshore and offshore combined. Again, there are significant developments in the Taroom Basin, which is east of the Surat Basin in Queensland, and the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory, where that particular field is indicated to become possibly one of the world's largest single producing fields of gas through shale, unconventional shale fracking. So this is a very important development, and one that is at the leading front, I guess, for the environmental impacts versus the economic benefits discussion and argument that's going on. And finally, the categorization over and above what you've seen above can be looked at in the lens, if you will, between export and domestic. And it's important to see this distinction because in the Australian environment, domestic extractive industries, if you will, or for domestic use, probably counts for about 10%, let's say, of our extractive industries, but about 90% is for export. And this has a very significant figuring in the equation of environmental impact and the pros and cons, because it brings in elements of regional security, trading partners, and indeed itself the whole issue of geopolitics. And against this, we have the environmental impact. So what are the main products that are extracted or materials in Australia? So we have, as noted before, conventional oil and gas. Australia is the third largest exporter of gas in the world. At one point, it was the single largest exporter of oil and gas. Our position has slipped to third behind Qatar, who recently increased their production, but now that has been taken out because of the war in the Middle East. And America is second. And I noted before the shale gas revolution, if you like, they've gone from a net importer of gas to a world's largest second exporter of gas, really in the matter of 7 to 10 years only, off the base of shale. And Australia is facing that same dynamics in our industry as we speak. Iron ore is our largest single material export. And again, it drives the economies of the world via China. Coal is a declining material export and production, but it is still significant. I think Australia is the second or third largest exporter of coking and thermal coal in the world. We have a very large gold industry, a mining industry, and a very large base metals. And by base metals, we're talking copper, nickel, and basically all other metal materials. Uranium is, whilst relative to the other items, is small, but it is big because small in dollar value, but we're one of 3 countries really that export uranium next to Russia and South Africa. And of course, that makes the supply chain very tight. And we represent, I guess, a stable base or country to export uranium. And then finally, of course, there's precious stones, as noted earlier. A lot of that is done by artisanal mining, but there is a reasonably large amount of extractive work done in diamond mining, etc. So what are the environmental impacts? The first and most obvious is land degradation. And It's a very interesting topic. For the most part, the remediation or the fix for that, if you will, the environmental impact is what can be loosely deemed as remediation. Now, in the case of open cut coal mines or open cut mines for that matter, and indeed subsurface mining, there is a requirement to backfill the pit, if you like, and restore back to as best as possible to the natural environment. And this is met with varying degrees of success. There are some great remediations that have been done, and you can scarcely see the impact of an ex mine. But there are also cases where the remediation has not been so great. And a good example of that is in Newcastle, where surface remediation was done. It looks great, houses been built, all looks good. And then 20 or 30 years later, you have the impact of subsidence. So it remains a controversial issue and a very real environmental issue that overall can be done better at. It's probably worth noting that within this, in the offshore oil and gas industry, remediation is looked at or termed decommissioning. And that has been a very successful story for the fact that those sorts of decommissioning activities result almost wholly in the situation where the seabed has and is restored back to its natural condition. So in that respect, it's been quite successful, and that's just the nature, I guess, of an offshore platform, which is as high production, very high production per single well. So removing the subsea infrastructure, there's not a lot of it for what it actually gives. Another big one is environmental impact, is water usage and aquifer impacts. And the water usage is related to taking of water for the daily production process, if you will, for extractive industries. And that, for the most part, is well managed because there has been a long history of water permits management and water management, surface water management in Australia, going back well over 100 years and stemming from the agricultural industry, where they've had to manage the limited resource of water between many competing uses. And within that, you have the mining industry, and they operate within that framework. And so they take permits, and it's quite well managed, such that there's no, let's just say, overtaking of water per se. There may be isolated incidents, but overall it's well managed. The question of aquifers, however, is quite significant. The aquifers exist far below the surface, and the impacts on an aquifer, or potential impacts of, let's say, the contamination of an aquifer, or the upsetting of the process of an aquifer operating, are not immediately obvious. It can take many, many years, 5 to 10 years, to witness, if you will, or evidence that an aquifer has been affected. And so this remains a very critical and important area to look at, such that we don't assess the environmental impact as being X, but find out in 20 years that it's X to the power of 5. So, and this remains a contentious issue, and one that needs a lot deeper examination. Supporting that, I guess, from the environmental side, you have the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, EPBC, which is quite strict, both on the water usage and examining the aquifer impacts. And that has been recently augmented with the Water Trigger Act, which allows really anyone, let's just say any citizen, if you will, to enact a call for a water trigger examination, which is if there is an immediate impact on the water table or water, and they can appeal to the Minister for the Environment to stop operations under a water trigger. So there are protections around that if something is seen that is perhaps not so great, it can be stopped immediately and then assessed to see what the impact is before either giving a go, no go for any further development. Under air pollution, again, it's covered by the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. And I guess it's worth noting at this point that the EPBC is, and we'll look at it a bit later, is a federal act, and it's derived from powers in the external powers clause in the Constitution, Section 52, which allows the Commonwealth to legislate for matters of international affairs. So we'll look at that in a minute, but that is the main legislation, if you will, for environmental protection. Runoff is an issue with any terrestrial open cut mining, oil and gas extraction, because the surface area of the land is always impacted. Again, governed by the EPBC, and for the very much the most part, suitable and satisfactory solutions are engineered to manage issues around runoff. Likewise with waste and tailings, covered under the EPBC, and it's managed by engineered solutions. And whilst I guess in the past there have been some issues around tailings, leakage and waste, in recent history, let's just say the last 20 years, there's been very few, which indicates that the level of protection given under the EPBC, the permitting, the examination of the activities, and the engineering to protect the environment would appear to be satisfactory. However, if we look overseas, for example, in some other countries, this is not always the case. And a very good example most recently is in Brazil, a big iron ore mine owned by BHP. The tailings dam collapsed, and an enormous amount of contaminated tailings water and mud went through the valley. Many people were killed and displaced. It is an environmental mess of global significance, and several years later, it's still there. The cleanup will cost several $billion, and indeed it has led to the suspension of the mine itself. So in the Australian context, it's probably okay, but in the international context, I think that there is some catching up to do. There is the issue of CO2, and this is not directly dealt with under the EPBC. Indeed, it was taken to court in the Northern Territory that the EPBC should consider the impacts of global decarbonisation in the process of environmental assessment. And the judge in that case decreed that EPBC environmental protection laws do not need to consider the global impact of CO2 emissions of any particular development in Australia. Now, that in some sense is being dealt with through separate policy initiatives by the government, roughly under the umbrella of net zero, and they attach various permitting to a demonstration by those extractive operators that they have a pathway to net zero. So the question is not so much being net zero today, but being net zero, say, by 2035. And certainly that there must be a demonstrable effort and shown that CO2 emissions are being minimized and there's a pathway to total minimization into the future. And then finally, the other impact is social and Indigenous groups. And this is a very, very important area. It's covered under the Heritage Protection Act, and it would be probably fair to say it's pretty good, but there are still instances of egregious environmental damage done, irrespective of the Heritage Protection Act. A good example of that is Rio Tinto's iron ore mine in the Pilbara, the Juukan Gorge caves case, where some ancient caves were basically bulldozed as part of the levelling of ground for the extraction of iron ore. What was not considered was the Puta Kinti Kurana people have lived on that land for many tens of thousands of years, and those particular Juukan Gorge caves held artifacts of indigenous existence going back nearly 40,000 years. And in this situation, the West Australian government had given a permit, if you like, under their environmental protection plan, that they could go ahead and do this. And they did. And so these caves were destroyed. And as soon as it became apparent that they were, this massive loophole in the environmental protection of heritage in Australia was exposed, because Rio Tinto effectively were allowed to do that legally. And there was no formal government sanction against them because they had permission under their environmental plan. It doesn't make it right, and there are consequences that fall outside of a direct fine. The CEO of Rio Tinto was forced to resign. Several executives, very senior executives, board members, were also fired, and they copped personal financial sanctions running to the many tens of millions of dollars. And it also triggered a complete review of Rio Tinto's operations in the Pilbara, and consequently much more rigorous attention was paid to the heritage and social indigenous groups' interests in that land. So not a good outcome, and I would go so far as to say I would expect that both Rio and anyone else in that industry would not repeat such an egregious destruction of a heritage site in the interest of mining. So that takes us to the regulations. And in the previous slide, we talked about the EPBC, but we'll start with what the environment is. Australia is a federation of 5 states and 2 territories. And they, for the most part, under the Constitution, have the rights to set the environmental framework for anything that goes on within their territory. Now, strictly speaking, within the Constitution, the federal government has no direct rights to interfere in the state matters for the environment. However, Section 52 of the Constitution is called the External Powers Act. And under the External Powers Act, the federal government may enter into international agreements, which they have done in respect to the environment. For example, the Kyoto Accord is a good example, and there are several others. And they are then constitutionally validated to then say we have an international treaty and we can enforce that treaty now back on the states. So we have, in effect, a 2-tiered system: the state-based environmental laws and if you want to call it hurdles or gateways to get through, and then there's the federal environmental law. And it's a cause of some angst, because operators in the industry do complain that they overlap too much, and it's like doing everything twice. But that's just the nature of the environment. And so under these environmental laws, federal environmental laws, as noted, the EPBC, the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, and also net zero, which they can withhold permitting, if you will, unless it's demonstrated that they're doing activities to meet those commitments that we've signed up internationally. Within all of that, there are industry codes, and they should not be discounted, because in some particular industries, those codes set an even higher standard for environmental protection than even the federal black letter law. Permitting down at the local level and even at the council level, again, is another area of environmental protection. There are independent interest groups. I mentioned earlier the Water Trigger Act, which allows an individual to challenge the entire process of, let's say, mining, if you like, or a particular mine, if it can be demonstrated that there is an immediate and negative impact on the water. And these groups are, for the most part, in the Australian context, listened to. There may not be a strict legal obligation to do that, but all the operators know, as noted in the last point, the social license to operate is very much dependent on the goodwill of the local and wider community. And if the independent interest groups are not, their concerns are not acknowledged and indeed dealt with, it eventually winds its way back to the federal EPBC Act and appeals to the federal government, and it can very much indeed put a cessation to any extractive industry development. And some good examples of that is the the gold mine, Tarifa gold mine out in Orange, where independent interest groups weren't brought on board, and as a consequence, that entire gold mine has stopped. Likewise, with the Narrabri gas project, which is a massive, well, could have been a massive uh, uh, terrestrial or onshore gas development, has also stopped because pastoralists had gathered together and made a strong case to put a stop to it. And in this particular case, Santos weren't able to um, satisfy their concerns. So independent interest groups play a very important role in the environmental protection around developments, even though they may not necessarily be supported by black letter legislation. So what are the issues? And everything is a balancing act. I think it would be fair to say in the Australian context, the vast majority of extractive industries is done responsibly. Some of course, will disagree um, and may take the line that any extractive industry is bad, but one has to be reasonable and weigh up all of the issues. Another big issue is the question of unknown future impacts. Now, it was Donald Rumsfeld who famously said there are unknown unknowns, and that can be, and indeed is the case with extractive industries. As noted earlier, there is an impending quote unquote shale revolution happening where there's extensive fracking of deep-seated shale beds, and whilst there's about 10 years of very solid evidence that it has minimal impacts, both on aquifers and the subsurface, but that's only 20 years of data. The question is, what happens in 30 years? And that is unknown. And so these questions of unknown future impacts do need to be examined very, very closely in the context of the net benefit of any new production. And this leads to the obvious point, I guess, and why we have these scales here, because no extractive industry does not come with an environmental cost. They all do. The question really is the economic benefit or trade-off justify that environmental cost? And again, this is a hotly contested issue. Some may say that any environmental cost is too much, and others will say that there should be a trade-off. And the consensus, one would have to say, across the broader cross-section of society is that the economic benefits in the current situation outweigh the environmental costs. That certainly can be improved, but people do want their fuel. They do want the all the benefits that accrue to extractive industries. And indeed, the argument that we should, for example, completely do away with the oil and gas extractive industry and go for purely wind turbines and solar energy, it sort of falls on its face a bit, because the very nature of putting up a wind turbine is inherently dependent on all these other extractive industries. You need gas to make the cement bases for the pylons. You need gas and coal to make the steel that goes into it. You need copper to make the turbines. And so the shift towards, let's just say, lower impact environmental costs associated in this very particular thing with energy itself is dependent on those extractive industries operating efficiently in the first instance. And indeed, some may argue that there are significant environmental costs to, wind turbines and solar in this example, that should also be weighed up against whether they should be there. And I guess an example of that is offshore wind, which for all intents and purposes has been shut down on the east coast of Australia simply because of the questions about a visual eyesore of these turbines sitting off our beaches. Another issue which is not very often brought up or raised, but it is really an important point to explore, and that is, if we shut down let's just say we theoretically shut down an industry. Well, the economic world and supply chains will not ignore that vacuum. That material will be sourced from somewhere else. And invariably and often, the that new source in another country which has much laxer environmental rules and regulations results in an overall net worse problem at a global level. A very good example of that was the shuttering of some nickel mines in Australia, Murrin and a couple of others. And that slack, if you will, was taken up by Inco in Indonesia, off the island of Sumbawa, with a Japanese mining company. And it is an environmental disaster that is still going on. It is incredibly bad. And I think any neutral observer who looks at the destruction that is going on, the contamination of the oceans and the land and the treatment of the local peoples, they would look at that and probably suggest that it would have been better if that extractive industry stayed in Australia, because it's a worse global outcome. Likewise with the production of iron ore, we mentioned earlier the big mine in Brazil. Well, many dozens of people died, massive destruction of land, contamination of land, and that simply just wouldn't happen in Australia under our regulations. So we have to be cognizant that in getting too tough, we end up exporting the problem. It doesn't solve the social issue. And the last one, is the status quo good enough? And one would naturally have to say the status quo is never good enough and it should always be better. I would personally argue that it's pretty good, but I would also freely admit that it can be better, and that there are numerous individual breaches and negative impacts in the environment that shouldn't have happened. However, under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and the various state laws, those instances are not systemic. They could be categorized as one-off, but it's not systemic. And so the status quo, I would argue, is pretty good, but we should always aim to do better. So, in conclusion, as I noted earlier, I think if one put aside the partisan nature of the topic and took the broad swathe of the Australian population, the consensus would probably say that the benefits do outweigh the costs. And indeed, if the broader population of Australia didn't feel that, then these industries simply would not exist, because parties would have been voted in to shut them down. And there are parties that advocate that, for example, the Green Party, but they never get anything more than about 10 or 12% of the popular vote. So that is a pretty fair statement that the general population would say the benefits outweigh the costs. But it doesn't mean that the general population remain unconcerned. And it is very apparent that people want extra vigilance, and vigilance is required, especially on new technologies that bring unknown long-term impacts. This can be both in the processing of minerals or oil and gas. I noted earlier the shale revolution. There's a lot of community concern that it at face value appears to be, very safe, but it's also fair to say that conclusion is derived off a fairly narrow data set of 20 or 30 years. So vigilance is called for and vigilance is required. And finally, overall, the obvious conclusion is that we must continue to strive to do better and adapt and adopt and develop world-leading technologies to lower the environmental impacts. We must aim for zero impact. We may not get it now, we may get it in the future, but the environmental question must be one of continue to do better, continue to develop and adopt world-leading technologies to lower the environmental impacts, so ultimately we can, in a sustainable way, enjoy the benefits. Thank you very much for your time. And I hope you found that an informative discussion about an environmental issue in Australia.